Coming up on this Wednesday edition of Newsline at noon, polling is underway in 15 constituencies in the country's largest ever by-elections. The outcome could reshape the political landscape for the remainder of the Park Geun-hye administration. Korea's industrial output grew at the fastest pace in more than 3 years in June on the back of strong exports and helped by a low base stemming from the April ferry disaster. Plus, the U.S. and the European Union slap additional sanctions on Russia in retaliation for its intervention in Ukraine. These stories and more on Newsline at noon. It's noon Wednesday, July 30th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Ju.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broom. Our top story this lunchtime, polling stations are now up and running in 15 constituencies around the country for Korea's largest ever by-elections.
Koreans living in the contested areas can cast their votes at polling booths set up in the 15 electoral districts until 8 p.m. Korea time. Political watchers have dubbed the by-elections a mini general election that will serve as a midterm referendum on President Park Geun-hye's conservative administration, as well as an evaluation of the opposition party leadership. The elections come hot on the heels of the local elections in early June, in which neither the ruling nor the main opposition party claimed a clear-cut victory. The voter turnout during the two-day early voting period that ended Saturday was just shy of 8%, a record for early voting in by-elections.
And now our Yulian is at a polling station in Seoul's Dongjak B district in what's been identified as a key race in these by-elections.
This is the only district in Seoul voting today and looks to be a very tight race. So, Lian, how is it there? Are you seeing many voters come to cast their ballots?
Hi, Mark, Jinju. After the morning rush here, where voters were rushing in to cast their ballots before heading to their work, things have been quite slow around here. I'm here at the Dongjak B district in Seoul, which is one of the most hotly contested seats for this by-election, and it is also a major swing region. When looking at the past parliamentary elections, candidates from the ruling Saenuri Party and main opposition party split Dongjak B, winning twice each. Now, this region also had the second highest early voter turnout rate, which shows the residents here are eager to have their voices heard. Now, in this district, ruling Saenuri Party candidate Na Kyung-won, who is aiming to become a third-time lawmaker, is taking on the minor opposition Justice Party candidate No Chan, who is expected to absorb most of the votes from anti-Saenuri Party voters after the opposition camp last week joined forces to field just one candidate. The two were neck and neck in the last opinion polls released last week, showing Na of the ruling party with less than 1% lead. Now, as for what voters would like to see from their elected leader, many talked about the investigation into April's deadly Seoul ferry disaster.
From the investigation process for Yoo Byung-hun to the Seoul ferry law, I felt frustrated that the ruling and opposition parties have been unable to come to terms. I voted for someone who could voice their opinions strongly at the National Assembly. The winning candidate should first focus on revitalizing the local economy. The public is so hurting from Seoul ferry tragedy. I hope our politicians do their best to relieve us of our pain.
Well, it's good to see citizens out there exercising their democratic right to vote. And what is the voter turnout nationwide at this hour? And how is this final voter turnout expected to affect the results?
Mark, well, the latest voter turnout as of 11 a.m. local time stood at 10.3%, and the National Election Commission expects the final voter turnout to be in the early 30% range, and that is pretty much the average for by-elections like this. Now, traditionally, older voters turn out in greater numbers than younger people, and because the older generation typically lean towards the Conservative Party, the participation rate of 20 to 30-year-olds will be a variable role in determining the ultimate results. Also, Mark, the weather will play a role as well. It's been very hot the last couple of days. The mercury is expected to touch a sweltering 32 degrees Celsius this afternoon in Seoul, and it'll be even hotter in other parts of the country. Now, high temperatures typically keep people at home and out of the polling booth, so we'll see how that factors in as well. This has been Yurian reporting live from a polling station in Dongjakbi district.
We'll be having more updates on the by-elections throughout the day and well into the night, so stay tuned. Now, moving on, Korea's industrial production rose over 2% in June from the previous month, the biggest gain in more than 3 years. But analysts say it's largely because output was too low in May following April's ferry disaster. Nahyun-kyung tells us more.
A 2.1% monthly rise for all industries and a 2.9% jump in the mining and manufacturing sector in production for the month of June. Statistics Korea says those were the biggest gains in more than 3 years and nearly 5 years, respectively. But analysts say it's merely because of a base effect.
June numbers look good because we saw a big drop in May. The indicators for investment and spending are not strong enough for us to see this as momentum for a faster economic recovery.
The rise in the mining and manufacturing sector is attributed to increased output in semiconductors and metal processing, driven by demand from both home and abroad. But investment in plants and equipment went down by 1.4% from May, and spending also only edged up by 0.3%. Although it was the first time the overall monthly output has risen since April's ferry disaster, experts say it's too early to say that the economy is emerging out of its sluggish spending trap. They add it doesn't mean the Korean economy is not improving, but the rate that it's picking up is still pretty slow. Nahyun-kyung, Arirang News.
The International Monetary Fund has once again urged South Korea to let the markets determine the foreign exchange rate. The international agency said Wednesday that interference should be limited to avoid excessive volatility that could hurt the economy. Now, the call from the IMF, which issued a similar statement at the start of the year, came after Seoul officials conveyed their worries in recent weeks over the fast pace of the Korean currency's appreciation. During a one-year period up to June, the won gained more than 12% against the greenback. The Monetary Fund also expressed concern about Korea's trade surplus, which accounted for more than 6% of the country's GDP last year, against some 2% seen as optimal. And domestic demand has remained sluggish for a prolonged period of time, so you might be surprised to hear that overseas travel spending by Koreans actually hit a record high in June. Data released by the Bank of Korea show Koreans traveling abroad spent slightly over $1.7 billion last month, breaking the previous record of $1.69 billion set in April. The figure has also led to post a new quarterly record of $5 billion in the April to June period. Now, experts attributed the spike in overseas spending to the growing number of Koreans traveling abroad for early summer holidays, coupled with the strengthening of the Korean won.
Korea has enjoyed an exceptional reputation as the global powerhouse in the shipbuilding industry in recent years, but the shine is starting to dull a touch at least. The country's Chinese competitors are gaining ground fast as their skills are quickly catching up to their very attractive prices. Our Kim Ji-yeon reports.
Korean shipbuilders are struggling. The world market share held by Korean shipbuilders has fallen to 27% this year, a sharp drop from the 40% recorded in 2011, according to data from Seoul-based BS Financial Group. Chinese shipbuilders have filled the gap, benefiting from better price competitiveness. Korea's Hyundai Heavy Industries has been fighting back, trying to boost orders of their so-called eco ships, or ships that come equipped with energy-efficient technology. Korea's Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering has followed a similar course. They are producing mega-sized container ships that use 20% less fuel and emit 30% less carbon. But despite these efforts, China has dominated the shipbuilding sector since 2012, leading with a 44% world market share. Hyundai Heavy Industries recorded an earnings shock in the first quarter of this year with more than $184 million of operating losses. Both Hyundai and Daewoo are each expected to record operating losses of around $68 million in the second quarter. The Korean shipbuilding industry is now eyeing new opportunities. A Daewoo shipbuilding official told Seoul-based Yonhap News that it will put more of an emphasis on its defense-related industries, which include building submarines. Hyundai Heavy completed construction of a new company in the southeastern city of Daegu in May that will begin producing ship engines. Samsung Heavy Industries says it will focus on renewable energy such as building wind power plants. Kim Jung, Arirang News.
Now, although they're still number one by quite a big way, Samsung's strong grip on the smartphone market has loosened considerably in the second quarter of this year. According to market research firm IDC, the Korean tech giant's share of the global smartphone market slumped to slightly over 25% in the April to June period. That's down 7.1 percentage points from the same quarter a year earlier. Samsung's major rival Apple also saw its market share dip, but only by about 1 percentage point to just shy of 12%. Chinese manufacturers are gaining ground fast, though. Huawei was in third place in the second quarter with an almost 7% market share, followed by Lenovo at 5.4%. While a global settlement of the seemingly eternal patent spat between Apple and Samsung has yet to materialize, the dispute appears to be losing steam at least a little. Apple says it will drop a cross-appeal against certain Samsung devices and accept the court's rulings. Apple has already tried to get an injunction against these devices twice in the past, but was denied both times. Apple's lawyers told the court this week that it will now focus instead on winning an injunction in their second mobile device infringement trial. Though Apple has dropped its latest cross-appeal, Samsung is still trying to have the original jury verdict overturned, and Apple is still seeking injunctions against some devices from the second trial, which took place earlier this year.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea. Connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on NEWSLINE at Noon with Mark Broom and Jin-ju.
I'm Jin-ju.
Market researcher, strategy analytics, said Thursday that LG Electronics brought in about...
Frosty relations between Seoul and Tokyo have brought bilateral cooperation to a near standstill at a time when North Korea continues to provoke the international community with missile launches and nuclear threats. And a top U.S. military commander has directed a plea at South Korea and Japan to set aside their differences and face the threats out of North Korea together. Connie Kim reports.
The top U.S. military commander in the Pacific says North Korea's nuclear capabilities have reached a serious level.
Their desire for nuclear missiles and nuclear capabilities, as we've said over and over again, are highly threatening to this global security environment.
Admiral Samuel Locklear added that South Korea and Japan should be working in step to curb the North's nuclear development, but that political tensions between the two is affecting America's ability to coordinate with its allies. Locklear said Seoul and Tokyo need to realize the importance of bilateral and trilateral military-to-military cooperation.
They have a common concern, huge common concern with North Korea, and that we encourage them to both Japan and South Korea to work together to overcome their political difficulties so that we can work to provide a better security environment in this region.
Historical and territorial disputes between Seoul and Tokyo have dipped bilateral relations to their lowest level in years. Those tensions have kept military cooperation at a minimum, despite repeated provocations from the North. This past weekend, Pyongyang fired off yet another missile into waters off its eastern coast. This just 10 days after the UN Security Council condemned the North for its previous series of missile launches in recent weeks. In the face of the hostilities, South Korean Defense Minister Han Min-gu said yesterday that Seoul and Washington were reviewing various ways to boost their joint combat readiness. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Washington expects fresh U.S. sanctions against North Korea will be as painful to the leadership as some very effective sanctions that were slapped on the communist regime back in 2005. Now, the new set of sanctions are aimed at blocking any financial support from the outside world to Pyongyang. Park Ji-won reports.
U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce says a new bill that passed the House this week will hit the North Korean leadership hard. In an interview with South Korea's Yonhap news agency, Royce said the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act will be as successful as previous U.S. sanctions on North Korea in 2005, known as the BDA sanctions. The BDA sanctions are considered some of the most effective ever placed on North Korea. They not only froze a key North Korean account at the Banco Delta Asia in Macau, but the measures also forced other financial institutions to pull the plug on their dealings with Pyongyang. The sanctions were lifted later in nuclear negotiations with the North. Royce said the new bill, like the previous BDA sanctions, aims to restrict North Korea's access to international financial institutions by targeting foreign banks to facilitate the North's illicit trading like money laundering and smuggling. The bill has a secondary boycott article which can sanction third country financial institutions or companies for trading with the North in violation of UN resolutions. The U.S. lawmakers stressed, however, that the bill does not affect humanitarian aid to the North. He emphasized the goal of the bill is to block the regime's financial support system. The bill also includes seizing assets linked to North Korea's nuclear proliferation activities, human rights violations, and thorough inspection of North Korean cargo. He also said Japan's independent lifting of some sanctions against the North is counterproductive as the U.S. loses some leverage against North Korea. Royce added the international community needs to move together in terms of imposing sanctions against the North. The bill has to pass the Senate and be signed by President Obama for it to become law. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Now, North Korea has already announced it's sending athletes and a cheering squad to this fall's Asian Games right here in South Korea, but now they want to send members of their state media. Citing an official from the Asian Broadcasting Union, Radio Free Asia reports that Pyongyang asked that 6 North Korean reporters be extended an invitation to cover the sporting event. Inter-Korean talks held 2 weeks ago on North Korea's participation in the Incheon Asian Games broke down without agreement, but Pyongyang has since said that it will still move ahead with its plans. The Games open in the South Korean port city of Incheon on September 19th. Now, Korea is seeing more babies of mixed races. According to Statistics Korea, 4.7% of the 484,000 babies born in 2012 in Korea were from parents consisting of one Korean and one foreign parent. The ratio has been on a steady rise since 2008, but is expected to slow down in the years to come. Stricter guidelines for marriage visas have reduced the number of biracial couples getting married in the nation. Time now for a look through some of the international headlines we're following on this Wednesday lunchtime. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim standing by at the News Center.
Eunice, it looks like Russia's support of separatists in Ukraine is now going to have a long and an expensive toll on its economy.
Right, Jinju. The European Union and the United States earlier this morning jointly placed their strongest pressure yet in the form of far-reaching economic sanctions targeting the sectors of energy, banking, and defense. Our Song Ji-sun has the details.
The European Union and the United States on Tuesday announced further sanctions against Russia in the strongest international action yet over Moscow's support for rebels in eastern Ukraine. In Brussels, the 28-member European bloc agreed to restrictions on the trade of equipment for the oil and defense sectors. Russia's state-run banks will also be barred from raising funds in European capital markets. The move marks the strongest confrontation between Moscow and the West since the end of the Cold War. This latest action was triggered by the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 by what was likely a Russian-supplied missile. Moscow continues to deny the charges. The U.S. also imposed sanctions on Moscow by banning Americans or people in the U.S. from banking with 3 Russian banks. President Obama said if Russia remains on its current path, the costs on Russia will continue to grow, and that the coordinated actions of the U.S. and EU will make the weak Russian economy even weaker. The sanctions could cost Russia some $30 billion this year, according to online media EU Observer. But if Moscow slaps back with similar action, the EU could suffer damage estimated at $55 billion. To mitigate the impact on the European economy, the new sanctions will not affect previous contracts, and Russia's natural gas, which powers European industry and lights its cities, has been spared. Russia is the world's biggest exporter of natural gas and the second biggest exporter of oil. 송지선, Arirang News.
Israel's amped-up offensive on the Gaza Strip continued into early Wednesday morning local time as another 13 people were reported killed and many others hurt in the northern region of Jabalia. A health ministry spokesman said among the dead were 5 members of the same family, a medic and an infant. This follows Tuesday's overnight strikes that targeted key Hamas infrastructure, including a satellite TV station Al-Aqsa, a central mosque in Gaza City, and the home of a top political leader, Ismail Haniyeh. Israel has rejected reports that it also shot through the area's only power plant. Meanwhile, foreign pressure has been mounting on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to rein in his forces. Local Israeli reports say a Palestinian delegation, which includes Hamas leaders, was expected to arrive in Cairo for peace talks. Health officials around the globe are on alert as an unprecedented Ebola epidemic claims more lives, now including the doctors treating those ailing. Dr. Sheikh Umar Khan was leading the fight against the contagious virus in Sierra Leone and credited with treating more than 100 patients. But he succumbed to Ebola yesterday following the death of a prominent Liberian doctor this past weekend. Dozens of other local health workers have also died and more remain quarantined. Despite efforts to contain the virus, Ebola threatens to spread. A case was confirmed in Nigeria's most populous city of Lagos after an infected American consultant, Patrick Sawyer, had boarded an international flight from Liberia and died. 2 major West African airliners, ASKI and Eric Air, have since banned flights to Liberia and Sierra Leone. Liberia has closed most of its land borders and quarantined entire communities. China's former security chief is being investigated for a suspected serious disciplinary violation. Xinhua news agency said the probe on Zhou Yongkang will be led by the Communist Party's corruption watchdog, confirming suspicions that arose after several people close to him were interrogated and the powerful former minister missing from the public eye in recent months. Zhou's investigation makes him the highest-level government official to be probed for corruption in recent years. He was a member of China's top decision-making body, the Politburo Standing Committee.
Good afternoon. Monsoon season officially ended yesterday, but due to atmospheric instability, there could be nationwide passing showers accompanied by thunder, lightning and gusty winds in the afternoon. But for the rest of the time, the skies should remain mostly to partly sunny throughout the day. And the steamy conditions continue with highs in some regions down south, soaring to the mid 30, so it's going to be hotter than yesterday, as the high in Seoul will rise to 32, while Daegu will climb to 34, and Gwangju and Busan should have a daily highs of 33 and 31 respectively. Now for other regions, it looks like Jeju Island and Daejeon will top out at 30 and 32, and Dokdo should see a high of 28. And as for the weather outlook here in Seoul, temperatures should be on the rise for the next few days. Then on Saturday, temperatures should drop a few notches, but it's still gonna be quite hot. So take good care of yourself to prevent heat stroke by drinking plenty of water and avoid too much sun exposures. Well, that's all for me today, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Well, thank you very much, Jeon, for the weather report there. And those are the stories we're following at this hour.
Mark and I'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Thank you for watching.